Welcome to Saving UX. I'm your host, Jeremy Kriegel. Every episode, I talk to UX veterans about the challenges facing our practice and what we can do to make it better. This is the second half of my conversation with Amy Heymans, founder and CXO of MadPow, as well as the host of the podcast Better Experiences. If you missed part one, go back and listen to that. You can watch it on YouTube, listen on most podcast platforms, and do both at sux.live. That's SUX for savingux.live. And now the second half of my conversation with Amy Heymans. So behavior change has certainly always been a big topic in UX, and we know from a lot of that research that the design choices we make, even as simple as what are our defaults, right, can have a big impact on behavior. There's also lots of dark patterns, and we have tons of examples of companies who are using design for only company benefit to the detriment of their customers. How should UX as a practice, how should we be thinking about ethics so that designers are using what we know only for the benefit of people and not to their detriment, or at least where our audience benefit and our business benefit are aligned, but not where they're misaligned and it's at the expense of our customers?
Yeah, that's huge. I have a good analogy, right? So you have a knife. You could use it to stab somebody, or you could use it to threaten somebody, or you could use it to do a surgery and save somebody's life. So yes, behavior change design, it's very powerful. And ethics is very important because it can be used to persuade, to manipulate. We're seeing, to pick on social media in the news, the apps may be very easy to use, but there are ramifications to that, that they could lead to depression, or they can upset, political discourse and cause and increase polarization of mindset through, the filter bubble, where you only see what you agree with due to the algorithm. And so it just keeps branching farther and farther. There's serious ethical concerns. Actually, we put together, I think it's designersoath.com or designersoath.org, but it's basically similar to the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. But what is our oath as designers? We know that the whole move fast and break things mentality, right? In Silicon Valley, but you have Airbnb not checking the safety and security of houses or warning people effectively, and then people ending up dying on the premises. Or you have safety issues with Uber and stuff like that. And it's like, if we took a moment, we could see these things coming potentially. I mean, so it's hard and it's deep to explore all of the externalities. And to think about the unintended consequences of our actions. But there are frameworks for that we can apply to our process, to ideate not just what we hope goes right, but what could potentially go wrong, right? And this has been said again and again, as designers, we want to design for the happy path, and that's good. But what are the consequences even of the happy path, right? If we get more and more people to consume a product that ends up in a landfill, is that really a happy path, right? So it has to do with also the values of the organization and the commitment that the organization wants to make to employees, to customers, to the planet, to society, et cetera. So that's where we center purpose-driven design, is articulating the goals of the business, looking at the goals and objectives of the customer, looking for that virtuous circle that can lift all, but also with an eye toward other consequences and externalities. It's big stuff. And you'd think that like a designer just sitting in a corporation doesn't really have an ethical commitment, but we all do, and we all can make an impact in our small section of the world.
So I think that this has come up. I think it was in my conversation with David Dylan Thomas, but I'll verify and put it in the show notes. But I think it was him who relayed a story about a female executive, I believe, at Twitter, and they were talking about all the abuse that happened and the lack of safeguards initially. And she was asked, if you had been on the team, how long would it have taken to put these safeguards in place? And her answer was, we never would have gone live without it. That if you'd had someone with a different perspective on what abuse is possible, you would know, you would see these things, as opposed to like the team of white guys that really doesn't think about online abuse or other things. They're not really subject to it as much, who that just wasn't a concern. In the arc of UX, are we getting better in that respect? Where are we bringing? How are we doing in terms of, from your perspective, bringing more voices into the practice? And where do you see us still needing to do more work there?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work on diversity and inclusion internally and with our clients as well. And we've been doing that in two ways. One is looking at designing from the inside out. So are our teams diverse? Are they inclusive culturally? Are we open? And that's from gender, race, context, and even, the diversity of ideas. Are truly all ideas welcomed? What's the hierarchy, the power dynamic, the decision-making structure, et cetera? And are we considerate of the lived experiences of everybody on the team? And then that extends outward into inclusive design for the products and services and solutions. Specifically in finance, we're looking at unbanked or underbanked populations. We're looking at how to evolve the financial relationship so that it is more of a relationship that is supportive of folks where they're at and helping them to get to the next level, as opposed to just designing for the wealthy. Actually innovating solutions that help people, get to that next goal they have in their lives. And then in health equity is huge. Making sure that we're improving outcomes. So for example, maternal mortality for Black women is higher than white women. And that doesn't even count, education levels. So it's pure race-based bias. We have so much work to do there. And I think it's going to involve being creative about how we bring folks in. We're going to have to update policies and processes and recruiting methods and create programs. I'm a big fan of the work that Antonio Mello is doing over at Humana. He's creating a way by which folks can come in and get training and employment, because as the website where all the Black designers, we need to get more folks to UX because it's a great career opportunity, and we're made better, of course. Obviously, the more diverse it is, the more resilient as an organization we will be. The more innovative as an organization we will be. So yeah, it's so important.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I want to go also, again, maybe dig back in a little bit of your history, maybe as it relates to the evolution of UX. When you talked about you and your business partner starting MadPow, you both, you had a visual design background, but it seems like you kind of split out those roles a little bit. You said you were doing the wireframe prototype, more interaction design research. Your partner was doing a lot of the visual design. There's a lot of discussion these days about the benefits, pros and cons of generalists and specialists. What's your take on that, and how has that influenced how you, what skills you look for when you're hiring designers at MadPow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I sort of did everything throughout my career and got that generalism, which was important for understanding the entire process and how all the pieces fit together, sort of sense making and synthesis. I chose to zoom into research and strategy. I just love strategy and the bold vision and stuff like that. Now, if somebody comes in pure research and strategy and they don't have the design background, of course they can extend to that, but also in terms of the visualization of ideas, there may be a gap there. So I think visual training is always great. Your PowerPoints are going to look better. You're going to be able to do diagrams. You might even be able to wireframe on the fly, etc. Now on the other side, but if you can't, it's good to have an appreciation for what's missing and then collaborate with other team members. And then on the other side, the pure visual designers, they are learning about all of the facets to be considered when they're creating a design. And I think that is strategy and synthesis. And I believe that designers should participate in research and learn sort of the other side. So, in our, 20 years ago in UX, right, we would have technical writers coming in, we would have engineers coming in, we would have just such a diversity of people entering the field. Now, as it's matured, somebody's going to get a design degree or a UX certificate and might have covered certain bases. But again, really, I think that the pursuit of the unicorn is, it makes sense because then you can have somebody who can sort of do it all. But I think there needs to be an appreciation for what people do best and what they want to do, and let them do that so that they can flourish and not force it. So a funny thing, back in the .com boom, my manager, who at the time is my now business partner, he told me I should learn Flash. And when I tried to do Flash, I felt like, so Flash was the motion graphics animation. I felt like I was banging my head against the wall. I was like, this is terrible. I'm not good at this. It's just the worst. And so it just didn't jive with me. But for him, he was so good at it. He loved it. So and he eventually let it go. And then we ended up starting MadPow together. But if he had continued to have me pursue Flash, I would have been miserable and probably would have quit. So, we can't have it all that way. So.
Earlier, you talked about futures thinking. I'm curious, as you've started to get into that practice, have you also thought about UX as a practice in that mode? What will UX look like 10 years, 50 years from now? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's interesting. UX is already evolving in terms of screenless design, where we're having to also design voice interactions, right? And then multimodal, right? Voice plus screen. And then sort of ubiquitous or ambient, right? Experiences. So how we experience technology is going to change. So how user experience folks address those new technologies, those methodologies, is going to have to change. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think designers are fantastic synthesizers and communicators, and we have this sort of intuitive sense for people and what's needed. And when you look at, and this is what is learned by, learning macro history and thinking about the future and futures thinking, you have typically artists are the first to pick up on a revolution. And, I remember graphic designers were like, oh, you're selling out. You're using your creative trade to go ahead and make money. So you're not a real artist. You're not a real creative because you're not just painting this thing. And, but I feel like at the core, designers are artists, and we are very sensitive to the movements, the revolutions, the psyche that's happening. And then we take that knowledge and we bring it to our work. And especially as we get more involved in the leadership of an organization, we're going to bring that sensibility to the table. I think there should be more designers in government. I think there should be more designers at the C level, because we see things differently. We synthesize things differently. We communicate things differently. And ultimately, most of the designers I've met, 9 out of 10, are doing this because they fundamentally want to improve people's lives in large and small ways. And I think that's huge. And that's not to say that, business people don't want that. It's just that we have a different lens, a different mindset, a different mojo. And I think it's a necessary, again, in the spirit of diversity, to round out the perspective and the techniques. So I think the tools will evolve, the methods will evolve, the technologies will evolve. And I hope the trend will continue where our discipline is more and more respected, more and more essential, and more a part of the business strategy moving forward, and connecting that to the big objectives in terms of the impact an organization has on people and society as well.
Yeah, I certainly would agree. Obviously, that as the tech changes, our tools changes, everything else is different. It, will evolve with that. One thing I've noticed, in the last 20 plus years that I've been doing that, is that there are those certain fundamentals that kind of stay the same, at least at a broad level, right? You start out like, do I understand the problem, the people, the context, so that I can, when I can put that together, then can I conceive of something that addresses that in some positive way? And then how do I validate that? And how often and how fast can I go through that loop? Do you see any, I assume that will probably stay the same. It's just the nuances and the evolution within that will be different.
Yeah, I think we need more ethics deliverables, if you will. And I'm thinking about that because as things change, and artificial intelligence is something that we take a part in designing or evaluating or understanding how we might leverage it within the context of an experience. We know that algorithms can be biased, and that AI can actually, again, create unintended consequences. We talked about how behavior change design can be wielded for good to help people to improve their lives, or be wielded for manipulation as well. So our ethical commitment is important, as individuals, in understanding that in our role, but also helping our teams. We've helped our teams to understand customers, to understand users. We can help our teams to consider the ethics involved, to consider the consequences, to help them understand the impacts. We just need the desire and, the deliverables. Can you imagine if we didn't, pardon the phrase, but incessantly nag engineering and business folks to pay attention to this? We literally talk to so many people, so many presentations and group therapy sessions and conferences, and in the direction of listen to the user. If you want to get this thing right, otherwise you're just going to frustrate people. You're going to do it wrong. Let's do this right. So I think there's going to be a new wave of tools, methods, and hopefully incessant nagging, but effective nagging, where we can push it in that direction as well.
What drives that gap? And I think I said in my intro, everyone says they want to be customer focused, but yet we're still doing this nagging over and over again to try and convince people to talk to and listen and pay attention to the folks they're trying to serve. Why the disconnect?
Yeah, it's like I've worked with a lot of people at health insurance companies. They're really, really nice people. They genuinely want to improve health and want to improve people's lives. But they're working at an organization that has specific objectives, and they're working within a system that's kind of messed up. And again, within their jobs, they have timelines to meet, they have budgetary constraints, they have the views of their boss, they have whatever conflict with the other organization, right? So there's all of these challenges, and sometimes it's just I'm sure you've seen, in the fad that was human-centered design boot camps, and they still happen, and they should happen. You've seen sort of a stakeholder's eyes just be open to, oh, wow, this is important. I never thought about things this way. And you could have told them about it, but until they experienced it, they didn't have that sort of eye-opening epiphany of the value of this. So I think it's just, it's not something that's been taught, though it is being taught more. Courses in design, innovation, and even empathy are getting introduced into curriculum in medical schools, as well as, business degrees. So it is starting to happen, and it is getting easier. I'm just saying that we need to keep fighting a good fight and pushing in even new directions. I think if we're not making people uncomfortable, or if people aren't going, well, what are they talking about? Then we're not sort of going far enough. Because we don't want to kind of join the mindset that forfeits the end user in the spirit of capitalism. We want to always constantly expand horizons inside the organization.
Earlier on, you mentioned co-creation as a practice within MadPow. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, typically we would do the observation, usability testing, one-on-one interviews, et cetera, even contextual inquiry, ethnographic studies, observation, et cetera. Really, the thinking is bringing people to the table of innovation to design with us. So instead of sort of a paternalistic relationship of you are a subject and I am the designer goddess, I'm going to get information from you that is going to help me solve all your problems. Instead, to invite folks into the process at every point. So co-creation sessions, workshops, it's like doing workshops with clients, but you're doing workshops with end users, customers, patients, what have you. We're doing workshops which, through the act of making, because making is research, whether we're making, whether they're making, we come to understand what's most important to them, value propositions, mindsets. In an ideal world, what would the experience be like? But you're getting a different lens and a more rich representation than you might get through a one-on-one interview. So those sessions can be used as research. So co-creative workshops as research. You can also use co-creative workshops for ideation to, so the initial workshops can be used to narrow in on the question, and then the ideation workshops can be used to sort of expand upon the potential solutions to the question, potential answers to the question. So they can be used for ideation, but also you could invite users into every step of the process to design with you as a part of the team. The pitfall to avoid is users or customer advisory panels have become so entrenched that now they don't have the fresh perspective of a normal user, because they're they just know too much at that point, and that's a pitfall to be avoided. Another thing to consider is that when people have participated in research with you, especially co-creative sessions, they want to know what happened. They want to see where it all ended up. And so when you think about respect for subjects in research, having that closed loop is really important. It's something we rarely consider. And there's IP and confidentiality considerations and stuff like that. But we see that in clinical trials, working with pharmaceutical companies, that people literally give their blood, sweat, and tears into a clinical trial, and then they don't hear what happened with that clinical trial, and it affects their desire to participate in a future clinical trial. But the same notion extends to
I agree with you. I found collaborative workshopping to be very helpful, very insightful. I've also encountered of our practice a criticism of that work, and I think the phrase democratization of design in a critical way of minimizing the work that we do by by everyone participating. It makes it seem like anyone can do it, and it minimizes the expertise that that a UX practitioner brings to the work. I don't know if this is a concept you've come across or how you would respond to that criticism.
So yes, there is a notion that if you bring people to the table, it's sort of saying, oh, anybody could do this. And, we know that. So it's like this. If you had a chronic condition that you were recently diagnosed with, and there were 4 different doctors that you needed to talk with and figure out what's your treatment going to be and how do these treatments intersect with one another and what's the plan, you'd want to get, maybe your spouse, maybe your other folks on your care team with the medical professionals to talk about what's needed for your treatment and stuff like that. Now, that doesn't mean that whole group can do the surgery or do the, whatever needs to be done. But to get the collective information is really important. So, I think we are arbiters of the process, guardians of the galaxy, so to speak. We need to sort of take people through the process and know when it's productive, when it's not productive, what's missing, how should we proceed next, what are the methods we're going to use. So you need that sort of very professional or expert guide through it. So it's not like we're turning everybody into designers. We're allowing them to join the design process.
I like that distinction. You're not turning someone into a designer. You're just incorporating them in part of the process. I mean, I would think it's a bit grand for us to think that we can do it all ourselves. Yeah, that we can do all the gathering, synthesis, and have all that. But I'm glad to hear you address it. Maybe one more question before we wrap up. If you're, feel free to decline. We were talking about diversity earlier, and one of the less visible elements of diversity is neurodiversity, which is starting to be talked about. And you mentioned ADD before. I have ADHD as well. I'm curious if you have anything that you might talk about how that has affected your life as a designer. Sometimes that can be described as a superpower in some way, but there's also challenges that come with it. Well, I don't know if that's something you have any thoughts on.
Yeah, there's the personal aspect, and then there's the sort of reflection on, our discipline as well. So, or even the business context. So yes, personally, ADD, studies say, and I confirm that women with ADD, you don't know it because they work overtime. The hamsters and the wheels in the brain are working overtime to not let anyone know, right? So the second you experience shame from inattention, you work on overdrive to never let that happen. So you might seem like you have it all together and everything's going great, but inside you're about to lose it because you're just, working so hard. That absolutely was my experience, but I also think that the ability to pay attention to multiple things and bring them together leads to a lot of creativity, and you sort of let your mind go in different places and then sort of pull it back. Also, the ability to hyperfocus. So folks with ADD or ADHD have the ability to hyperfocus, and that can be really good when you need to create a masterpiece. But I've, through my career, I don't know if it's my ADD or just me, but I have problems with punctuality. I have problems with interrupting because my brain is just like the impulse, and I'm afraid I'll forget it. I often do if I don't say it right away. And this is part of like knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses. I recently read a book on strengths. It connects to the Gallup Strength Finder, which I recommend if you haven't done it. But the theory there is know your strengths and focus upon your strengths. It's kind of like the thing I mentioned before, go to where the love is. And if you work on amping up your strengths, as opposed to accommodating for your weaknesses, that you'll go a lot farther. So instead of feeling bad or apologizing for that which makes us different, looking at the good stuff and just focusing there. So if I spent every day of my life trying not to interrupt people, I would, number one, fail, and number two, feel really terrible about myself. So I've just had to accept this and many more things as part of who I am. And the people who are in my life, that I love, and my coworkers, they come to understand, the way that I am, and that's very kind. Now, extrapolating that out to, the industry and business in general, yes, diversity and inclusion, the fact that people are fighting battles, experiencing emotions that we will never know by looking at them. You never know the burden that somebody has on their back at any given moment. This can be with relationships, with challenges related to neurodiversity. It could be challenges with financial security. Any myriad of things can be affecting folks, and to not judge people by their challenges that they've experienced in the past, or even their mistakes, because guess what? We've all made them. But by their potential and by their desire. And I think that's so important. It actually relates back to the education discussion is, the trappings that we use, the modes, the paradigms that we use to sort of judge one another and choose whether or not we're going to welcome somebody into our world, needs a serious evaluation. And I'm so happy that we are doing this work now, and it needs to continue.
Well, Amy, that's probably a great place to wrap up. It's a wonderful point to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today. If people want to hear more from you, where should they look for you? Like Twitter, LinkedIn? What's your channels of choice?
Yes, LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm currently shunning Facebook and Instagram, and I also have a podcast called Better Experiences, so you can hear from me there. But yeah, I'd love to chat with anybody who has an interest in this conversation. Thank you so much, John.
It's been a pleasure. I'll put the links to your podcast, to the people, and all the other things that we've talked about in the show notes, and folks will be able to find that at sux.live. That's SUX for savingux.live. Make sure you subscribe either where you're listening, or you can subscribe via email on the website so you don't miss any future conversations, and you can also see all the past interviews. So again, thank you so much for joining me, Amy. It was a great pleasure. Really appreciate you sharing and being as open and honest about such a wide range of topics. So thank you so much for being here. All right, until next time, I'm Jeremy Kriegel, and this is Saving UX.